Yeah. So there's this interesting phenomena that's very characteristic of societies, I believe pretty much everywhere it's being studied. Now, you can calculate an index called the Gini coefficient. And the Gini coefficient is a number that represents how much inequality of income distribution there is in a given geographical area. So you could calculate a Gini coefficient for a street or an area in a city or a state or a country. You can do it at all those levels. And what you find is, you always hear this idea that poverty causes crime. That's a classic left-wing idea, but it's wrong. It's seriously wrong, and it's importantly wrong, and it's definitively wrong. Not only that. So there's no argument about this. It's already been established. What causes crime, especially aggressive crime, is relative poverty. And relative poverty is not the same thing as poverty at all. It's seriously not the same thing. Poverty is when you don't have enough to eat. Relative poverty is when the guy next door has a much better car than you. So, and there's lots of relative poverty in the United States, and there's some absolute poverty, but even the absolute poverty in the United States is nothing like the absolute poverty, say, in places like India or in sub-Saharan Africa, where absolute poverty means you have nothing. Now, what's really interesting about the Gini coefficient is that if you go to places where everyone, roughly speaking, is poor, say by national standards, I think South Dakota was often used as an example, or maybe one of the maritime provinces, like Newfoundland, where there's low average income, but it's pretty flat distribution. There's almost no crime. And if you go to places where everyone's rich, then there's almost no crime. But if you go places where there are poor people and moderately well-off people and rich people, and the distribution is really steep, then the rate of aggressive behavior among young men, and it's usually within their own ethnic group, starts to skyrocket out of control. And the reason for that seems to be that if the dominance hierarchy is too steep, then the young men have no likelihood of climbing to a dominant position while playing the standard social game. And so what they do is turn to aggression to make their mark on the world. And it works too. That's the other thing, is that, make no mistake about it, if you're looking for status in a place where status is hard to achieve, and you're the meanest, toughest guy around, then, and around a bunch of people who, like you, don't have much money, then you're going to benefit from that status. It works. Yeah.
Would that be part of the reason why? Because I think the violent crime rate in the U.S. is higher than it is in Canada. Would that be part of the reason why?
Sure.
Okay.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, you can make a real conservative argument for making sure that the conservatives are very anti-income distribution, and we figure that's because of the guys that have this male independence. They identify with this male independence factor. They don't want to be distributing resources to people who are down the dominance hierarchy because they want them down in the dominance hierarchy. They want there to be a difference between the people on top and the people on the bottom so that they can be the people on top, so that it increases their relative attractiveness. Like, it's a perfectly logical game. And they presume that, well, the rules are set up and every man can go for it, do his best, and the winner wins and the loser loses, and that's just how it is. And don't ask me to fix it because I don't want to, And besides that, I find it distasteful to attempt to fix it. More than that, right? Because it's a moral issue. It's not just an intellectual issue. So you can make a case. However, you can make a case from the conservative point of view, especially with regards to, say, beliefs in religious traditionalism and the desire to maintain social stability, that you shouldn't let income distribution become too unequal. Like, one of the big things your society has to do is to make sure that doesn't get out of hand, because it tends to get out of hand. It tends towards a few people having everything and almost everyone else having nothing. It's a natural, in a sense, it's a natural consequence of economic progression, which is actually something that Marx pointed out, although an Italian named Pareto had figured it out at approximately the same time, and I think with a lot more conceptual clarity. But the more unequal you let your society get, the higher the probability of death, roughly speaking, through violent causes. And but I'm telling you why it is that men want to climb the dominance hierarchy, and the reason they want to climb the dominance hierarchy is because that's how they get access to women.
Professor, like to actually ask earlier in this discussion when you're talking about the familiar and the unfamiliar and the structure. So it seems like we all want to live within a structure, but we don't want the rules to apply to ourselves.
Well, we have this contradictory problem. We want to be protected by the structure, but we want to advance our position within it. And so that means what that should mean, and this is, I think, the definition of civilized behavior, is that you're allowed to advance your position within the structure as long as you don't disrupt it negatively. And I think most people do that. In fact, I think people in civilized countries do that so effectively that it's an absolute incomprehensible miracle. I can't understand how or why it ever got established. But like a psychopath will climb the ladder and cut the rungs off underneath them, fundamentally, right? It's like he doesn't care. He doesn't even care if the damn thing maintains itself. He's perfectly willing to have it destroyed after he's exhausted it. But if everyone acted like that, or even if a fairly substantial percentage of people acted like that, the whole thing would come to a halt virtually, like in no time flat. So I mean, why? See, you might, here's a reason, likely. Because one of the things we were talking about was masculine violence. Now, the thing about masculine violence is it only tends to emerge in situations where there don't seem to be any other reasonably viable means of advancing status. So it's not reasonable to say that men are aggressive. You can say that on average men are more aggressive than women. And you can also say that if you put men in a situation where they can see status differences, but they have no means of moving forward, that they're likely to turn to aggression as a way of establishing dominance. And then you can say that that's the reason for that is because it makes them more attractive. The fundamental reason.
Yeah, just like to add on, I read this article once that talks about how polygamous societies are more violent than men.
Yeah, absolutely.
For the same reason, because like when one guy has two wives, that means there's 50% of the population have no.
That's right.
No access to sex.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That the evolutionary psychology explanation for the pathology of polygamy is that once you let it establish itself, then the men get ultra-violent.
So would you say that like monogamy would almost be like the basis for like civilized society?
Many people have said that. And yes, I think you can make a strong case for that. And I think the fundamental reason is the one that you just pointed out. The idea is, well, would you rather have one woman or die? Or sorry, that's not quite right. Would you rather? No, that's not quite right. It's more like, would you be willing to limit yourself to one partner, or have a shot at many partners but a much higher probability of dying?
Yeah.
Right. And some guys will take that. They'll take the high risk approach. So now, this doesn't eliminate the difference in individual differences in determining who's going to be aggressive, because what will happen is that as the Gini coefficient pressure rises, the more aggressive men, the men who are more aggressive by nature, will get more aggressive first, right? So you can imagine it's a threshold phenomenon in some sense. So, and what I should tell you as well is the relationship between the Gini coefficient and male-on-male homicide isn't like 0.2 or 0.3, which is about the correlation that you'd get if you were predicting something like that using personality. It's like 0.8 or 0.9. It's like it eats up all of it. It's the explanation. So it's a huge effect. It's so big an effect that you can basically say, oh, well, we figured that out, although psychologists never know when they figured anything out, and they keep endlessly retesting it over and over and over because, we don't know how to bring our science to a stop. But if you don't accept the Gini coefficient aggression data, it's like you might as well throw the rest of social sciences out the window because the effect is unbelievably powerful.
What geographical area does this take place in?
You can do it at any level of analysis. You can do it by county, you can do it by city, you can do it by state, and you can do it by country. And it works on all of those levels.
Like it predicts aggression?
You bet. Yeah, and that's a great question. I mean, the methodologically sophisticated studies have done exactly that to ensure that it's actually this phenomena rather than other factors that might be operative in that particular geographical area. So countries with a higher Gini coefficient are more violent, and cities within that country that have a higher than average Gini coefficient for that country are more violent on average. It's a very, very robust finding. So, all right, so we're going to say, for the sake of argument, that you've got the male dominance hierarchy, and it's represented as masculine. Now, one of the things Jung said, he thought that women carried an image of men in their unconscious, and he thought that the image that women carried of men in their unconscious was a group of men, not an individual man. He called that the animus. Whereas he believed that the image of women that men carried in their collective unconscious was of a single woman, and he called that the anima.
Borders are reasonable. How about that? The law is the border that stops someone from stealing your laptop. And if it's an Apple laptop, well, it's the sort of laptop that a social justice warrior would carry. And then the social justice warrior is going to be very irritated if you happen to purloin their laptop. And then you might point out to them, you know, it's a border that protects you from having that thing taken. And they say, well, the border should be open. It's okay, man, no problem. You hand over that laptop right now. And everything else you own too. If you don't like borders, and you can get rid of the damn walls in your house, and you don't need doors on your bedroom either. And we can keep an eye on you whenever we want. And so much for borders. One of the things that really differs between liberals and conservatives, between the left and the right, is the right likes tight borders between things. It's part of being conscientious at every level, conceptually, sexually, familially, provincially, nationally. The right says, look, let's keep the borders between things pretty distinct. And the left says, yeah, maybe not, because some of those borders are in the wrong place, and a little bit more free flow of information wouldn't be a bad thing. And the thing is, they're right, but so are the conservatives, and that's why you have to talk. It's like, well, we've got some borders. That's a good thing. Maybe some of them need to be moved around a little bit, and that's what the political dialogue is for. But that doesn't mean that borders themselves are a bad idea. They're a great idea, because without borders, everything mashes into the same untenable state of undifferentiated chaos, and you can't live in that. And so the people who are trying to tear down the borders conceptually, politically, and practically, what they want is the chaos that would bring. They either want that, or they're too foolish to know that their pursuits will produce that. So let's be a little bit clear that if you stand up and say, yeah, borders, they're okay. They've got their problems, but they're okay. That doesn't make you a bigot beyond redemption. It just makes you someone with some sense. And it's actually okay to be someone with some sense. Limits on immigration are also reasonable. Well, we need to figure out what those limits are. And that's what the bloody political dialogue is for. But the fact that it should be limited to some degree is also reasonable. Otherwise, why not just open the borders and let everybody come in? Well, the reason you don't do that is because a complex system cannot tolerate extensive transformation over too short a period of time. Now, you want immigrants to come in, especially if they're the sorts of immigrants who are likely to contribute properly to the success of your polity. And lots of immigrants do that. I mean, I think the vast majority, for example, of entrepreneurs in the United States come from the Indian subcontinent. So great, you know, bring them over. They're highly educated, they're extraordinarily productive, they make lots of new businesses, and then they pump money like mad back into India. Good deal. But that doesn't mean that we have our arms are open to everyone immigration policy, because it's complete rubbish. All that means is you're not thinking about it. So, and here's a coda to that for conservatives. Here's something. I've been thinking about this a lot lately. It should not be assumed that citizens of societies that have not evolved functional individual rights predicated polities will hold values in keeping with such polities. So we could say, look, there are a lot of countries in the world that are not governed well. The vast majority of them, right? And they've been not governed well forever. And to me, that means that there's something wrong with the values that are held collectively by the people who've established those polities. Well, you shouldn't be naive and assume that merely because you move them to a new country, they're going to let their innate democratic longings flourish. It doesn't work that way. So if you stand up and say, look, let's be a little cautious. Let's make sure that we don't transform our society so rapidly that we lose what we have. Let's be careful about that. That doesn't mean that you're a morally reprehensible demon. It just means that you're conservative, and it's a reasonable position to hold. So there's no sense in apologizing for it. Now that doesn't mean you get to hide your bigotry under a mask of moral virtue, The discrimination issue is quite clear as far as I'm concerned, so that's associated with bigotry. If you have two people who are applying for a job, you should pick the one that's most qualified and not pay any attention to any of the other attributes of the person that have nothing to do with the job. Okay. Right. I think we figured that out in about 1965. Now, we're not doing it perfectly, but it's not that much later than 1965, and our society, particularly in Canada, is pretty damn open. You can come in here, and if you work hard, and if you're fortunate, you don't get sick, and God smiles on you, so to speak, you can be successful. There's still prejudice, unreasonable prejudice and discrimination, but our society is not, as the radical egalitarian equity promoters have it, structurally racist, bigoted, and misogynistic. No. Thinking is an offensive act, which is why tyrants hate it, right? Because one of the rules in a tyranny is, don't think. Why? Because I already know all the answers, and you're supposed to accept my answers as the tyrant, and so there's no need for your thinking. And you might be saying, well, my life isn't going as well as it could, and the tyrant says, well, you don't get to think that, because in my utopian tyranny, everything's perfect. And if you're suffering, that means you're politically suspect. Because you're suffering, your inability to recognize that the utopia has already manifested itself, your unhappiness is actually a political crime. But if you just keep it to yourself, well, we'll let you keep your head. But if you have if you're driven to the extreme where you have to express the fact that you're unhappy, perhaps, that your child doesn't have enough to eat, then it's off to the gulag with you and all your family as well, because there'll be no thinking here. And even if there is, there'll certainly be no talking. Here's something that happened recently in Venezuela. This is worth thinking about for all the people who harbor collectivist utopian dreams. Venezuela, the Venezuelan government, about 2 months ago, this was reported in the New York Times, which is not a newspaper, I would say, that would be intrinsically biased against Venezuela, said that it was now illegal to diagnose the cause of a child's death in a Venezuelan hospital as starvation. Because the Venezuelan government's answer to the problem of children starving was to make it illegal to notice it in hospitals. And that's a tyranny, right? That's a place where thought is not allowed. That's a place where free speech is not allowed. So it seems to me that that's not a good place to go, to say the least. And we've gone there many times in the last 150 years, and we should perhaps think very hard about whether or not we ever want to go there again. Okay, well, the same turns out to be true of chimpanzees. So Frans de Waal, who's a Dutch primatologist, a very smart one too, he's been interested in the biological basis of morality as well. And he's written a lot of good books on primate behavior, chimps in particular. Chimps are brutal creatures, man. Like, they go to war, eh? And so if you have a chimp territory out in the jungle, then the juveniles will, the males in particular, they'll band together in groups of 4 or 5. There's often, but not always, a female or 2 with them. And if they come across chimps from another troop that aren't within their hierarchy, let's say, they will, if they outnumber them, because they can't really count, but they can estimate magnitude visually. It's not the same as counting. But if they outnumber them, they will tear them to pieces. And chimps are at least twice as strong as a really well-developed human male. And so they can tear you up pretty good. And chimps are perfectly capable. They hunt. They're carnivorous, like human beings. And they hunt colobus monkeys often. They weigh about 40 pounds. And they'll basically eat them alive. Monkeys screaming away like mad because, it's in pain because it's being eaten. And that doesn't slow the chimps down a bit. There's no cross-species empathy stopping them from having their snack. And so chimps are very brutal creatures. And it isn't obvious they have a lot of internal inhibition of their aggression at all. Most of the inhibition is sociological. It's out in the hierarchy. And so the reason chimps aren't always aggressive with one another is because they know who can pound them and who will gang up on them and who won't. They establish their hierarchy. Anyways, you know, you think about a chimp hierarchy and you're talking about a fairly strong and aggressive creature. You might think it's biggest, ugliest, meanest, most vicious, irritable, unpleasant chimp that rises to the top. Well, that's kind of the postmodernist view of human society. But that's not the case. It happens sometimes. But what happens, and DeWall has documented this quite nicely, is that tyrant chimps lead unstable regimes. Now, you know, that might sound familiar because the same thing, of course, is true of human beings. And why is that? Well, it's because, you know, people don't like tyrants, and chimps don't like them that much either. And chimps are actually quite reciprocal in their social interactions. So they don't just dominate each other, they groom each other, they have friendships, they contract social relationships over very long periods of time. You know, and they do that. And so they engage in reciprocal interactions, let's say pro-social reciprocal interactions. And you might think, well, what's the weak point of the biggest, ugliest, toughest chimp in the troop? And that is he doesn't have any friends. And so, you know, maybe he has a bad day. He's a little hungover or whatever from eating fermented bananas or whatever he is partying with. And two of the slightly less ugly, slightly less mean chimps decide, well, this is a good time to take him out, and they tear him to pieces. And so one of the things DeWall has pointed out quite nicely is that if you want to have a stable chimp dominance hierarchy, let's call it a regime, the stable ones aren't ruled by the tyrants because the tyrants get taken out by paired up friendship dyads, something like that. So that's really worth thinking about too, you know, because it indicates that even in creatures that have less complex sociological orders, and they do, because one of the things that predicts how complex your social order is how big your brain is compared to your body. It's encephalization, essentially. And the more encephalized a creature, the larger the social groups it can track. And of course, human beings are very highly encephalized, so we have quite complicated group organizations. But even in simpler group organizations like the chimps, it isn't the tyrant who rules stably. And that turns out to be also incredibly important.